Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast, our expert panelists will be discussing the issue of responding to rogue states. For our program today, we've assembled a panel of experts on peace negotiations, national security, human rights, and war crimes. Joining Talking Foreign Policy for the first time is Todd Buchwald, who served as the State Department's Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice and Assistant Legal Advisor for UN Affairs, and he is currently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I've known the ambassador since we worked together at the State Department 25 years ago, so I'll dispense with formalities and just say welcome to our show, Todd.
Great to be here.
And we are also joined by another new guest, James Johnson, who served as Chief of Prosecutions of the Special Court for Sierra Leone after a 2-decade career in the JAG Corps. And he is currently the Director of the War Crimes Research Office at Case Western Reserve University. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Michael.
And we have two Talking Foreign Policy regulars back with us today. First, Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize-nominated NGO that has provided legal counsel in a dozen peace negotiations over the past 22 years. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Michael, it's great to be back.
And also with us in the WCPN 90.3 Ideas Stream studio is Professor Milena Stereo, who is the Associate Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law and a renowned international law expert. It's good to have you back on the program, Milena.
It is great to be here, Michael.
So let me kick things off by asking Ambassador Todd Buchwald, how would you define what is a rogue state?
Well, it's very interesting. It's not really sort of a legal term, and it doesn't really have a sort of fixed meaning. For the most part, it's been used as a way to talk about states that don't abide by norms on nonproliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. That's the way it was used early on by the Clinton administration, though at some point the Clinton administration made a concerted effort to stop using the word because they thought it was interfering with their ability to conduct diplomacy with countries on the list like North Korea, who they engaged with. In the Bush administration, it came to be used in association with the famous axis of evil countries. And again, it was about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. And there was sort of a background noise to the whole thing about that you might be a target for regime change at some point, sort of in the air. So that was in the Bush administration. In the Trump administration, President Trump has used the term when he spoke to the General Assembly last year, and he added Venezuela to the list. And that was interesting because it's sort of a different kind of rogue state. I mean, one can sort of easily sort of see that it's not sort of a very comfortable state to deal with. But it was different in the sense that, unlike the most of the states, it was its threat was sort of, or its rogueness was directed internally rather than externally. So that's the way it's used. I think by and large, it's still about externally directed threats.
I think you have now coined a new phrase that we may be using today. It's rogueness. So based on the rogueness criteria, let me ask our expert panel, which countries in the world do you all consider to be rogue states? Todd, let's start with you. What would be on your list?
I still tend to think of the states as the security threats, the security rogues. That those are maybe because my background as an international lawyer, those are the states that tend to have the more sort of immediate.
So the worst ones in your list would be?
Well, the worst ones on my list, the worst ones on the executive branch's list would still be sort of Iran. You would have thought North Korea, but there's a sort of strange relationship now with North Korea. But I would say those two are probably the top of the list.
Paul, what would you add?
Oh, I would definitely keep North Korea on the list. Yeah. And then I would add the triumvirate of Syria, Sudan, and Burma, or Myanmar as they like to be called. Highly destabilizing both internally and externally.
And Milena, what would you put on the list?
For some historical perspective, you might go back to, for example, Libya under Gaddafi, certainly at the end of that regime. And I certainly agree with both Paul and Todd regarding their list. You might go back and say Serbia or the FRY, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia under Milosevic as well.
But not currently in either of those cases?
Not currently.
Okay. And Jim, is there anything we're leaving off?
Well, I think that I might add. I don't think Paul mentioned it was Yemen. I think I might add Yemen to that list.
Okay, so what about Cuba? Would any of you put Cuba on that list? Todd?
It's a funny kind of list to be put on because you don't know what it is that happens when you're on it. But I think the relationship with Cuba is probably at this point
Less roguish?
a highly political dimension to it. But I think it really sort of is a little bit different than the other states on the list.
What about Turkey? Things are getting pretty out of control in our relations with Turkey. Would you put them on the list? Anybody?
I would. When I think of rogue states, I also think of states that are willing to essentially flagrantly act roguely. That might be a new word too.
So like invading another country, sending internet attacks on other countries,
using chemical weapons,
well,
things of that sort.
What about Russia?
Well, Russia actually is very good at using international law rhetoric to justify its actions, right? Russia doesn't, although it does things, it doesn't stand up and say, oh, we don't care about international law.
So is a rogue state only one that says we don't care about the rules?
Well, the other difference, I think, is, if we're defining rogueness, are we talking about it from the U.S. perspective, or are we talking about it from some objective perspective, global perspective,
What's
right?
The
I think
difference?
there's a difference. There are states that are clearly, a threat perhaps to the U.S. And when we talk about, for example, Turkey, we might say, okay, U.S.-Turkey relations are really at a low point right now. But from a global perspective, I don't think Turkey is on the same level as like Syria, for example, or some of these other states.
Okay, so focusing on those states that are threats to the United States that you've listed, Paul Williams, why should the U.S. care particularly about those countries?
Well, I think, Michael, there's two reasons why the United States should care about rogue states. The first is that they directly impact our security. The United States has security interests woven throughout the globe. And when you have states either by the very strict definition of rejecting the norms relating to terrorism, or as the broader definition of rogueness that we seem to be establishing here, this impacts our ability to maintain security of the United States or our allies. So, for instance, with North Korea and its nuclear weapons, it has the ability to annihilate South Korea and Japan, possibly the ability to strike the United States. With Syria pushing millions of refugees into Turkey, into Europe, it's highly destabilizing. So Turkey may not be rogue, but it is certainly on the verge of being destabilized. And there's consequences that we've seen throughout Europe. So these states acting outside the bounds of the normative structure that the Americans have worked over the decades to create substantially impacts our interest. And then I think it's important in the last 10 seconds just to say that if they impact their own populations as well, that's also something Americans used to and should continue to care about. Burma has pushed out 700,000 of their own civilians into Bangladesh, and some would call what they've been doing genocide. This is something that may not impact our security interest, but we should care about it.
Okay, so most of the countries we've been talking about, it's the government itself that is acting roguish. What about those countries where there are terrorists or rebels or pirates that are operating freely because they're failed states? Milena, do you think there's a difference between a rogue state and a failed state?
Sure. I definitely think there's a difference. As you correctly stated, most of these rogue states that we just mentioned are ruled by governments that have effective control over the territory of those states. So Assad, for example, a few years ago, maybe Syria was in a different category, but right now President Assad has control over most of Syrian territory. Other presidents of the states that we mentioned have control over their territory. A failed state, to the contrary, is a state where the government no longer exercises effective control over the territory, which then allows groups like non-state actors, terrorists, pirates to operate with impunity. And the classical example of a failed state would be Somalia, where, for example, in the late, about 10 years ago, pirates were basically free to roam because there was no effective government oversight.
So whether we're talking about a failed state or a rogue state, let me ask the ambassador, when is it better for the U.S. to act in concert with others through the UN or NATO, and when do you feel it's necessary for the United States to consider acting on its own?
Well, I think in principle, I think it's always better to act with others and as large a coalition as possible. If you have this picture of a rogue state as a state that's sort of playing outside the accepted lines, if you are in concert with others, you're able to more clearly demonstrate where those lines are. So if we're the only ones saying you're playing outside the lines, it doesn't sort of resonate nearly as much as if the entire international community plays outside the lines. Now, when you talk about the international community, it's a concept. It's there is no, you can't go to a meeting of you can't touch the international community. So the different configurations of the international community. So if you have the United Nations or the Security Council acting in a way, that's the clearest way to project the idea that the international community writ large is concerned. But depending on what country you're talking about, so if you're talking in Europe, for example, getting NATO on board is a very powerful tool. People want to be seen as playing within the lines for the European partners. So multilateral is better. There are times, however, when it won't be possible to act multilaterally, and I think the United States will always reserve to itself at least the prospect of acting unilaterally. If for no other reason, then you have to reserve that prospect as part of sometimes the campaign of building a multilateral coalition.
And I think you're mostly talking about use of sanctions, use of force. Let me turn to Jim Johnson. As an international prosecutor, when should prosecution of leaders of rogue states be considered and pursued?
Well, first, Michael, let me just state that I think your question assumes that there might be an international tribunal or some judicial body that is capable of carrying out a prosecution. Unfortunately, in many instances, if you look around the world today with leaders, this may not be the case. But there is clearly the precedent developed by Nuremberg and reinforced by the modern tribunals that makes it clear war crimes, crimes against humanity, are committed by individuals. And as a head of state, you are responsible, and as a head of state, you have no immunity from international crimes. So indeed that you can be prosecuted. And so when you're looking at when you should be prosecuted, I'm a prosecutor. And that's first and foremost in my mind. I believe that when there are reasonable grounds to believe that a leader has committed a war crime or a crime against humanity, that action should be taken towards the prosecution of that leader. Beyond that, you also are going to want to look at the gravity of the crimes that have been committed, how many victims you're having, where are those victims, are they internally, are they externally? Not that I think that they should not be. These are some of the kinds of things that you look at, I think, when prosecuting a leader.
Well, we're almost out of time for our first segment. When we return, we'll focus our discussion on the case study of Syria, the greatest humanitarian crisis facing the world in the last decade. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and WCPN 90.3 Ideas Stream. I'm Michael Scharf, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today by the former U.S. Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice, Todd Buchwald, the international prosecutor who convicted Liberian President Charles Taylor for war crimes, Jim Johnson, famed peace negotiator Dr. Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and international law guru Associate Dean Milena Stereo of Cleveland Marshall College of Law. We're talking today about the challenges of responding to rogue states. In this segment of our show, I'd like to focus the group's attention on the crisis in Syria. Since the beginning of the civil war there in 2011, the Assad regime has killed and displaced millions of people, and on several occasions the regime has used chemical weapons in opposition-controlled areas. Syria has become the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time. Let me begin by asking Ambassador Todd Buchwald, why hasn't the UN Security Council been able to take action to respond to the growing crisis in Syria?
Well, in many ways, consensus in the Security Council is the most important place to get consensus. Under the UN Charter, if the Security Council takes a decision, all UN member states, basically every country in the world, is under a legal obligation to accept and carry out the decision. That's Article 25 of the UN Charter. The UN Security Council has 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. And the way the Charter is structured, a decision can only be taken if all 5 of the 5 permanent members concur in that decision. And of course, in the last several years, the Russians, acting in sort of protection of the Syrian client state, have vetoed a number of resolutions, including a resolution to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court and a variety of other resolutions related to Syria that were favored by us and many other countries.
So what is it about Syria that Russia likes so much? I mean, they do have a port in Tartus. Is that important to them?
I suppose it's important to them, and I suppose what's important to them is their influence in the area. And I think part of what's important to them is it's partly a way to sort of demonstrate that they have to be met sort of on their terms. There have been lots of proposals to sort of get around, lots of ideas for getting around the idea of the Russian veto. There are ideas to sort of amend the Charter of the United Nations to sort of take away or limit the use of the veto. But it's pretty hard baked into the way the whole decision-making process is, that it works. And so the reality is I don't think there's a way around it. I think in the reality of that, people more and more will come to sort of other ways to sort of organize the international efforts. In Syria, it's hard to sort of do anything effective because the Syrians basically are winning the war, and that's sort of a reality that lawyers and policymakers in Washington have a hard time dealing with.
But the U.S. has taken matters into its own hands. On April 6th, 2017, the U.S. fired 56 cruise missiles at a Syrian airbase after Syria deployed sarin gas in the town of Khan Sheikhoun near Damascus. And then on April 14th, 2018, the UK, the U.S., and France together fired about 105 cruise missiles at Syrian chemical weapons production and storage facilities after the Syrian government deployed chlorine gas in the Damascus suburb of Douma. Milena, do most governments and legal experts believe that these airstrikes were lawful under international law given the Security Council's paralysis because of Russia's veto?
I think that most governments and legal experts as of now do not believe that these airstrikes were lawful under international law because international law has a very basic norm, which is a prohibition on states to use force against other states. And the only two well-accepted, well-recognized exceptions to that ban are situations where there is Security Council approval for the use of force and self-defense. And as Todd just told us regarding Syria, there is no Security Council authorization, nor will there be one in the near future because of the Russian and perhaps Chinese veto. So the Security Council is a no-go in this situation. And it's very hard for the U.S., the UK, and France to argue that this is somehow in self-defense because it looks like Assad is really using chemical weapons, other force against Syrian citizens, Syrian civilians. And so the only one argument that some scholars, and I know you, Michael, are starting to talk about this and write about this, is this idea that humanitarian intervention is another exception to this ban on the use of force. And so unless we're willing to accept this idea of humanitarian intervention without Security Council authorization as an exception to the use of force, it is hard to legally justify the airstrikes.
People have been talking about this for almost 20 years. Paul, for example, you participated in the negotiations at Rambouillet to try to avert the Kosovo conflict. And after the 1999 NATO airstrikes against Serbia to halt the ethnic cleansing of the Kosovo Albanians, the UN did endorse something called the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine. Does that doctrine permit unilateral humanitarian use of force like the airstrikes on Syria?
Well, Michael, my sense is that we're very close to having a legal doctrine which permits the unilateral use of force. As Todd has pointed out, Security Council authorization is hard baked into the UN Charter, but it's being rampantly abused by the Russians to provide cover for states like Syria who are committing mass atrocities against their civilians, for maybe 500,000 killed by the regime. Milena properly pointed out that the doctrine was created to allow for states to intervene when a country was unable or unwilling to protect its population, or where it was actually, in fact, carrying out those atrocities. The early versions of R2P require a Security Council resolution. But I think we've seen in Kosovo, there was a humanitarian intervention by NATO with no Security Council resolution. We've now had two interventions, first by the Americans and then by the Americans along with the French and the British in Syria, where there's no Security Council resolution. I think the flagrant violation of its responsibilities by Russia at the UN, coupled with this increasing trend of countries massacring their own civilians is definitely tipping the scales in the direction of some type of souped-up responsibility to protect, which will no longer require authorization by the Security Council. And quite frankly, Mike, that day cannot come soon enough.
So about 70 countries around the world chimed in with support of the U.S., UK, French airstrikes on Syria last April. The only countries that were against it, quite frankly, were Russia and Syria, and then China joined in. Does this overwhelming support and other factors indicate that something is changing, as Melina pointed out? Let's sort of unpeel the onion and see, how this new case might be different than other cases. So first of all, let me ask the panelists at large, does it matter that this case was about chemical weapons use and the targets were chemical weapons facilities, as opposed to in the other cases, it was sort of a broader crimes against humanity risk, and the targets were just broad targets? In the Serbia case, they just bombed anything that was a military target, right? So does that make a difference, Todd?
I think it, whether rightly or wrongly, I think the way international law works, it does make a difference. I think clearly something's changing, and people's willingness to sort of accept this kind of thing is way higher and goes up more and more because of all the atrocious behavior we see in Syria. Whether a new legal rule is emerged is not necessarily the same question. When you look at the way the president talked about what he had authorized, he didn't really talk about it in terms of humanitarian intervention concepts. He talked about it in terms, like you're talking about, of the special threat that weapons of mass destruction play. He's dealing with it in a situation where U.S. troops are already in the theater. And it seems to me that in a way, a not completely elegant way, but in a way that you can sort of feel the attachment to, he's sort of groping for sort of a self-defense kind of explanation for what he's doing, which may be a good, maybe a bad explanation. But what's interesting is he's sort of averting, explaining, justifying what he's doing by an appeal to a humanitarian doctrine. I think some people think that if the real motivation may be the wrong word, if the real rationale were humanitarian intervention, there were probably ways to save more lives than bombing those chemical facilities. That if the idea is to get your most humanitarian bang for the buck, this wasn't it. There's a different explanation for why this happened. That's at least one way to look at it.
Melina.
The other thing that I would mention that's really important regarding this particular intervention in April of 2018 is the language rhetoric used by the states, particularly the UK.
Yes.
Right? The UK government specifically talked about humanitarian intervention and how this was legal. When you go back to the Kosovo case, the State Department was very explicit that Kosovo was sui generis. It wasn't supposed to create any kind of a precedent. These were unique circumstances. We're not arguing that humanitarian intervention is actually legal. And in the Kosovo case, others talked about how though that intervention was legitimate but not legal, and there was moral authority for it, even if there wasn't legal authority. Now the UK government is saying this is humanitarian intervention, this is legal, and the U.S. government is basically making statements like we're in complete agreement with France and the UK.
Let me ask you, so Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the United Nations from the United States, said that at the Security Council. There is a doctrine in international law that if a country adopts another country's positions or another group's positions, if they ratify it, they can be held to be responsible for it. Isn't this, this kind of language that Nikki Haley used when she said we are in lockstep and in complete agreement with the UK right after the UK stipulated that this was humanitarian intervention? Isn't that close to that doctrine? And I'll tell you, the doctrine was once used in the ICJ in the case of Iran's adoption of the protesters who were students attack and take over of the U.S. Embassy. And the International Court of Justice said the government of Iran is now responsible because they applauded that action and they said that we agreed with it. Well, how is this different? Todd?
I think actually what she said is a little bit, sort of that purposeful ambiguity where lockstep with them is sort of, around there and supportive of your allies. I think it's hard to get away from what the president said in supporting it. I think that in any case, for the doctrine to sort of really take hold, it will take more than the United States. I mean, there are countries that say humanitarian intervention is lawful, including the United Kingdom. And, if you go back in the early 90s, I think is when the United Kingdom first said that humanitarian intervention was lawful, and they had some very basic criteria that you had to meet to be within the rule that you can act for humanitarian purposes. And including sort of in Iraq in the early 90s, where they were sort of protecting Iraqi minorities, taking military action to protect Iraqi minorities. And they had their theory, which was a humanitarian intervention theory. And we had our own theory, our own defense of it, which sort of constantly sort of talked away from humanitarian. It was like, come up with any other explanation in a way. And we had a theory about the way the particular Security Council resolutions worked and so forth. And I just, to me, what I see going on is the administration constantly sort of coming up with a different reason other than humanitarian intervention to justify what they did. For it to be real customary international law, people are going to have to stand up and say, clearly, this is what we think.
Paul, what do you think?
Michael, I think the Brits have this right. The Brits realize that in today's world, you're going to need to engage in humanitarian intervention in cases like Kosovo and cases in Syria for your own national security and then also just to protect, quite frankly, humanity. The Americans for decades have been dodging this question, the silliness of it's illegal, but it's legitimate, and any possible rationale we could come up with. Quite frankly, it's time for the U.S. government, and I think the Trump administration to a degree has. The Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel memo sort of hinted around, as Todd said, 3 ideas, but it did talk about the acts of using chemical weapons making the humanitarian catastrophe worse. So it's inching towards humanitarian intervention. But it's time for the Americans to be serious. We are doing humanitarian interventions. Let's create a legal framework like the British have for those interventions. Let's do it in a limited circumstance with limited scope, as little force as possible. But let's create a legal framework around it. Let's not have it run free range around the globe, because that's when the Russians, the Chinese, and the others take advantage of a wobbly legal doctrine.
I will note that Harold Koh, who was the former legal advisor at the State Department, has chastised both the Democratic and Republican regimes of the United States for not being specific when they do humanitarian intervention and doing instead what Todd was describing, having these factors and saying it's sui generis, which means, there's no precedent, this is an exceptional case. And what he said is the risk of that is that other countries will abuse the precedent, because you're creating a very amorphous precedent. And it's not that you're creating no precedent, which is what I think the U.S. hopes is happening. Instead, you are creating a precedent, but it's one where you are letting the genie out of the box and people can interpret it in all different ways. And I think that's what you're getting at. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, the Russians have used a version of this humanitarian intervention for their intervention in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Crimea, eastern Ukraine. None of those are humanitarian interventions.
But the answer is not to say, well, then there shouldn't be any humanitarian interventions, but to cabin it off with some very
Michael,
precise rules.
Russia is citing the Kosovo precedent, right? Although we're saying the State Department is saying it's not a precedent.
This
Russia
is Harold
citing,
Koh's point.
Exactly.
Right?
And Harold Koh said that, we as lawyers shouldn't be, I think he called us potted plants, right? That it is our duty to get out there and exactly.
We're creating precedent. Let's stop pretending we're not creating
one
precedent.
One of the lawyers in the room is a prosecutor. Let me bring our war crimes prosecutor, Jim Johnson, back into the conversation. Jim, what is being done to pave the way for war crimes trials of President Assad and others in Syria that are using chemical weapons, that are using barrel bombs, that are torturing people and seem to be getting away with it?
Well, Michael, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the concerns right now is that for many of these presidents, for many of these leaders of rogue regimes, there is no option to prosecute them, as in the case of Syria.
What about the Europeans who are using universal jurisdiction? Is that working?
Well, so far they have not pursued a case against President Assad that I am aware of. And so when you look from an international perspective, there does not seem to be an option to prosecute him. Attempts to either create an ad hoc tribunal or to refer this case to the International Criminal Court have been vetoed by Russia and others in the Security Council. And so you don't have a forum that's available to prosecute them. But that doesn't mean that steps are not being taken. The most critical element of cases of war crimes and things like this is to get in and to collect and preserve the evidence.
And that's being done?
And that is being done, and initiatives are taking place to help that process along. First, really since the start of Syria, you have seen many NGOs and other organizations that have been attempting to collect and gather evidence in Syria, and most importantly, to preserve that evidence. And now the United Nations has taken taken steps. The General Assembly has created the International Independent and Impartial Mechanism, which has been created to collate and collect evidence of war crimes in Syria, to bring all of this together, to initiate efforts of their own to collect and preserve this evidence, and again, have it ready and preserved, which is the most important part in preserving that evidence, so that eventually, if there is a prosecution that can indeed take place, it will. You look at Cambodia, for example. I mean, it was 30 years later when Cambodia finally created a tribunal that could try the genocide in Cambodia.
Well, and meanwhile, if countries are getting impatient about prosecutions, I do note that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bob Woodward's new book said that the White House had considered seriously the assassination of President Assad. Let me turn to Paul. What's your take on that? What are the pros and cons of using assassination as a policy tool against rogue leaders?
Wow, that would be the ultimate humanitarian intervention. It's highly dangerous. It's highly unpredictable. It's highly destabilizing. I think this would be returned to the bad old days of targeting individual leaders, which is something, although we're quite extensively engaged in targeting terrorist leaders, we've very much moved away from the bad days of targeting heads of state. To do so without a plan for state building, without a plan for an alternative government, could be very dangerous and very destabilizing, and wouldn't accomplish the objectives that one is seeking in terms of stopping the atrocities on the ground.
And I suppose it could turn us to the old West, where countries are just trying to assassinate each other's leaders left and right.
Yeah,
right now there's a taboo against that.
There's a taboo, and that taboo supports our strategic interests.
All right, well, it's time for another short break. When we return, we'll talk about some of the other rogue regime flashpoints around the world. Back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by some of the world's foremost experts on dealing with rogue nations. In this final segment of our broadcast, I want to ask our experts to discuss some of the other states that the Trump administration has labeled as rogue regimes, starting with Iran. Paul Williams, tell us why Iran should be on our radar as a rogue state.
Well, Mike, if we were to employ Todd's rogueness scale, we'd find that the Iranians, they are at the top of the scale. So when the Iranians aren't busy building nuclear weapons or attempting to build a nuclear weapon or ballistic missiles, delivery systems for those nuclear weapons, they're overseeing tens of thousands of elite Iranian troops operating in Syria, fighting against the Syrian opposition, committing atrocities against the Syrian people. They're also funding and directing Hezbollah, their operations inside Syria. They're heavily engaged in Yemen, providing assistance, weapons to the Houthis. They're providing ballistic missiles to the Houthis in Yemen that can reach Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, have reached Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. They still maintain a vast terrorist network throughout the Middle East and North Africa. They basically are a highly destabilizing actor in the region.
All right. Well, the Iranians do sound from that description like the bad boys of the Middle East. We, until recently, had an Iranian nuclear accord, which the United Nations and the inspectors said was actually working. Milena, why did the United States pull out of that?
Sure. So the agreement, which was signed back in 2015, provided essentially that Iran was temporarily halted in its production of enriched uranium for military purposes. The accord was going to be valid for 15 years, and in exchange for that, there was an easing and lifting of UN sanctions against Iran. So Iran had definitely financial incentive to stay in the agreement. Now, President Trump, back when he was candidate Trump, pretty often talked about the Iran agreement as a bad deal, bad agreement that he wanted to pull out of. And now he's announced that we are indeed pulling out. Now, there doesn't seem to be a plan B, so it's sort of unclear, what happens now in terms of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iran. But in terms of explaining why he did that, many people have talked about this idea of essentially undermining President Obama's legacy. If you view the Iran agreement as one of the high points, of the Obama presidency, it has to do with undermining that, turning more strategically towards our allies such as Israel and perhaps Saudi Arabia, and then the influence of some more hawkish advisors advisors in the Trump administration, such as, for example, Mike Pompeo, now as Secretary of State, and John Bolton as the National Security Advisor.
Well, you said there didn't seem to be a plan B, but prior to being appointed to that position of National Security Advisor, John Bolton did publicly advocate Israeli airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. Ambassador Todd Buchwald, what would be the pros and cons of either U.S. or Israeli airstrikes against those nuclear facilities?
Well, there are actual examples of the Israelis attacking nuclear reactors in Iraq in 1981, a reactor called Osirak. And at that time, the United States actually condemned the Israelis, with President Reagan saying that, sort of mitigating it a little bit, saying, well, maybe they really believed what they were doing was right, but there was a clear condemnation. There was another attack by the Israelis in 2007, same idea, though it wasn't acknowledged until much later. But it's a hard situation. I think that legal concepts will only dictate to a certain degree, and not that great a degree, what countries' decisions will be in using force in situations where they feel themselves under existential threat. But as a practical matter, if you're going to do something like this, thinking about something like this, you have to sort of think through the situation. What are the benefits? What are the costs? And how are you going to mitigate the costs? And how are you going to get away with this? And how are you going to find the reactors? And very importantly, how the world is going to sort of react to, even if you can pull it off, how the world is going to react and where you will end up in the rogueness scale. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a lot easier to say when you're out of government that this is a good idea than to sort of do it. And I suspect that this is not really in the cards for the foreseeable future.
I hope you're right about that. Paul Williams, let's go to a slightly different part of the globe. You've been involved in peace negotiations in both Yemen and the Sudan. Can you bring us up to date on what the situation is in those countries and what policy options you would recommend for the United States with regard to them?
As Todd pointed out, now that we're all out of government, we have lots of leeway to recommend policy options. So I've got a few there. Both Yemen and Sudan have become never-ending wars. In Yemen in particular, you've got a 3 or 4-way conflict by the parties in Yemen, but it's been a spill-in conflict with the Iranians, the Saudis, heavily engaged in supporting the parties, and the Americans, the British, and the French providing a lot of weapons to our allies, the Saudis, the UAE, others that are engaged. The problem with Yemen is there's no momentum. There's two problems. One, there's no momentum for a peace process. And two, our allies, the Saudis, have incredibly bad aim. And a number of civilians, thousands of civilians, have been killed by American-made weapons. It's time to bring an end to the conflict in Yemen. The Americans have a lot of leverage that they can put on the Saudis and the others to be serious about engaging in the peace process. And with the continued sanctions on Iran, there's also international leverage to get the Iranians to be serious. But it's going to have to be the Americans and its allies which pressure our allies to come to the table and negotiate a peace. In Sudan, we've got nearly 30 years of conflict. This is the Darfur genocide. This continues. There's also expanded conflict in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. This is a case where we actually have a tribunal for Jim. We have a tribunal. The International Criminal Court has indicted the president of Sudan for crimes against humanity, and yet he wanders the globe. We need to be serious about putting pressure on countries like South Africa and other countries which host President Bashir in the face of the International Criminal Court and threaten sanctions on them for them to comply with sending Omar Bashir to the ICC to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Until we're serious about ending these conflicts and until we use the leverage that we have, we are going to see these wars without end and continued genocide, crimes against humanity, civilian casualties.
Let me bring Jim in on that question. So, Jim Johnson, you have prosecuted a head of state, Charles Taylor of Liberia, at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. As Paul mentioned, al-Bashir, the president of the Sudan, has been indicted for genocide, and he just pops over to neighboring countries. He's even gone as far as China, and they allow him to come in as an honored guest. And the International Criminal Court screams and yells, he's under indictment, you have to arrest him, you have to send him to us, and nothing happens. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, takes the case to the Security Council and says, you're the Security Council, you sent this case to us, do something, and they don't do anything. What does this tell us about the state of international criminal justice?
Well, Michael, it doesn't necessarily tell us anything good. States are going to have always and will continue to act in what they see as their best interest. And one of the largest impediments that the modern international tribunals have had from the start, when you look at the Yugoslavian tribunal, the Rwandan tribunal, our tribunal, and now the ICC, is getting states to live up to their obligations to these tribunals. It took us 3 years to bring Charles Taylor into our custody after we indicted.